talk about immigration in the U.S.
The U.S. foreign-born population reached a record of 44.8 million in 2018. Immigrants today account for 13.7% of the U.S. population, nearly triple the share in 1970.
And Mexico is the top origin country in the U.S. immigrant population. In 2018, roughly 11.2 million immigrants living in the U.S. were from there, accounting for 25% of all U.S. immigrants. The next largest origin groups are from China, India, the Philippines, and El Salvador. A lot of other smaller shares, of course, come from Europe, Canada, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and the Middle East. And among those who arrived to the U.S. are Asians, and they outnumber a lot of Hispanics.
By race and ethnicity, more Asian immigrants than Hispanic immigrants have arrived in the U.S. in most years since 2009. Immigration from Latin America slowed following the Great Recession, particularly from Mexico, which has seen both decreasing flows into the United States and large flows back to Mexico in recent years. Asians are projected to become the largest immigrant group in the U.S. by 2055.
And there's a lot of immigrants who are working in the U.S. About 29 million immigrants were working or looking for work in the U.S., making up 17% of the total civilian labor force. Lawful immigrants made up the majority of the immigrant workforce at 21.2 million. They alone account for 4.6% of the civilian labor force, a dip from their peak of 5.4% in 2007. During the same period, the overall U.S. workforce grew as the number of the U.S.-born workers and lawful immigrant workers.
So talking about all these workers and specifically the percentages that are immigrants, the overall majority of Americans have positive views about immigrants. About 2/3 of Americans, which is 66%, say immigrants strengthen the country because of their hard work and talents, while about a quarter, 24%, say immigrants burden the country by taking jobs, housing, and healthcare.
Yeah, so where do all these people live? Nearly half, which is 45% of the nation's immigrants, live in these three states: California, Texas, and Florida. California has the largest population of any state since 2018 at 10.6 million. Texas, Florida, and New York have more than 4 million immigrants each. Immigrants are a big part of the U.S. That's why we also have refugees. The difference between immigrants and refugees is that immigrants choose to move in order to have a better future for their families and themselves. As a refugee, they have to move to save their life or preserve their freedom. So according to the pewresearch.org, in 2019, 30,000 refugees were allowed entry from the Democratic Republic of Congo, followed by Burma, Ukraine, Afghanistan. Among all of the refugees admitted in a fiscal year of 2019, 4,900 are Muslims, which is 16% of them, and 23,800 are Christians, which is 79%.
So, how many of these immigrants have been deported under the Trump administration? So, based on the information from the pewresearch.org, in 2018, 149,000 criminal immigrants were deported, while 188,000 non-criminal immigrants were deported as well, without committing any crimes. And it's been this way since 2001. More non-criminal immigrants have been deported for no reason at all. So who's behind all these deportation cases? ICE is behind it. ICE stands for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and ICE agents are responsible for preventing illegal immigration and preventing the unlawful traffic of goods into the U.S.
So who's at risk of being arrested? Anyone without lawful immigration status, people with status, people with permanent residence, refugees, visa holders who have a certain criminal convictions. ICE agents usually identify the person they arrest ahead of the time. They go to their homes, courthouses, shelters, even workplaces to look for the person. Increasingly, they'll wait outside the street just to make the arrest.
So if you're on this list, these are some things that you should know. ICE agents often pretend to be police, and they say they want to talk to you about identity theft or an ongoing investigation. But the reality is, ICE agents are not police. These agents are not allowed to enter your home or search your belongings without a warrant signed by a judge. Those arrested or ones in question do not need to provide any sort of documentation and have the right to remain silent and ask to speak with a lawyer. Talking about ICE, They have been used for threats against immigrants, manipulating them and exploiting them. In 2008, ICE raided Agri Processors Inc., which is a kosher meat packing plant. During this raid, 389 undocumented immigrants were detained, many of whom had no previous criminal record. Authorities, due to stereotypes, immediately see migrant workers as criminals, anti-citizens, and a threat to society, leading to extreme violence towards them. In the same year, about 960 migrants were charged with identity theft and social security fraud at their place of employment. What these police officers fail to realize and consider is the action of the employers themselves. These employers are not allowed to hire unauthorized workers, and because of E-Verify, it is very difficult to commit such crimes. These employers are committing crimes themselves, but these actions are overlooked due to the stereotypes and discrimination that takes place in the workforce. For example, in 6 years, only 11 employers were arrested, with 3 being jailed and 7 being only fined, while in 1 year, 85,000 unauthorized workers were arrested. These workers are so desperate to make any type of money, but due to their status are given less than minimum wage and treated very poorly. Employers threaten them in order to ensure that they do not complain and just do their work. As an example of what ICE raids and exploitation of workers look like today, we are going to go over Armando and Julia's ICE story. Armando is a father to 5 children. He goes to work very early in the morning and works until night, while his wife works all night and returns early in the morning. His eldest daughter, Julia, who is only 14 years old, is the caretaker for her other 4 siblings and must wake up early in order to help her siblings get ready for school. On the morning of August 7th, employees at Petco Foods, where Armando works, began running and yelling, "Outside, outside, that's ICE, we need to hide." Armando ran, but was soon caught by ICE agents. The first question was not, "What's your name?" or "Show me your documents." Rather, "Are you Hispanic?" and tied their feet together with rope. Armando was afraid they would pull out guns if he resisted, so he remained quiet instead and followed the agents as well as his fellow co-workers into a bus that took them to Jackson, Mississippi. Once he got to the detention center in Jackson, Armando was provided with all these forms asking for his name, family, and birthplace. After a brief interview, the agents put an ankle bracelet on him and gave him a court date and allowed him to return home. His daughter, Julia, was attempting to contact the detention center throughout the time Armando was there, but they would either not answer the phone or say to call back later. This event has taken a huge toll on the family, financially and mentally, burdening the family with the fear of losing their home and supporting their young children, as well as the fear of their dad being taken away at any time.
Many people are being taken to these detention centers, and we found some specific information from the New York Times in Espanol. All of this information is going to be based on family separation on the border. The next evidence you will hear is in Spanish. Los 5 fiscales estadounidenses asignaron a la frontera con México, 3 de los cuales fueron diseñados por el presidente Donald Trump. Reaccionaron en mayo de 2018 de manera desfavorable a un orden para procesar a todos los inmigrantes que ingresaron de forma ilegal a los Estados Unidos, incluso si eso implicaba separar a algunos de los menores de sus padres. Les indicaron a funcionarios de alto rango del Departamento de Justicia que sentían una gran preocupación por el bienestar de los niños. This states that 5 Border Patrol agents in Mexico, more importantly, 3 of them were sent by Donald Trump, and in 2018, while processing immigrants, they decided to separate the children and their families. According to the same article, Jeff Sessions states, quien en ese momento era el fiscal general, dejó muy claro que eso era lo que deseaba Donald Trump en una conferencia telefónica sostenida esa tarde, según reveló una investigación de 2 años liderada por el inspector general del Departamento de Justicia sobre la política de la tolerancia cero que separó a muchas familias. Decían, tenemos que separar a los niños, le dijo Sessions a los fiscales. Según las notas de los participantes, uno incluyó una taquigrafía. Lo siguiente, si les importan los niños, no los traigan. No vamos a darle amnistía a los que vengan con niños. basically the states that Trump has zero tolerance policy for immigrants and demanded to separate families, and that if they really cared about their kids, they wouldn't have brought them. They would not give amnesty to those who come with children. Continuing with our evidence, la separación de los niños inmigrantes de sus padres, en algunos casos durante meses, era un aspecto central del ataque del gobierno de Trump contra la migración. Sin embargo, la violenta reacción pública cuando el gobierno tuvo dificultades para reunir a los niños con sus familias se convirtió en uno de los peores desastres de la política del actual presidente. Overall, the separation between the families became one of the worst disasters for Trump because of the complications uniting the family after.
Not to mention Trump's strategic acts on immigrant families, in which he was severely criticized by the public. So, diving deeper into this idea of detention centers and bringing it back to current day, hysterectomies have been happening without consent in the detention centers, where women feel pressured based on the circumstance they are in. Today we'll be discussing two women's stories, and we will be beginning with the story of Wendy Doe. Wendy Doe was startled awake early one morning in January 2019 when guards called her out of her cell block in the Irwin County Immigration Detention Center in rural Georgia, where she had been held for 4 months. She would be having surgery that day, they said. Still groggy, the 48-year-old immigrant from Jamaica, who had been living without legal status in the United States for 2 decades before she was picked up by immigration authorities, felt a swell of dread come over her. An outside gynecologist who saw patients in immigration custody told her that the menstrual cramping she had was caused by large cysts and masses that needed to be removed. But she was skeptical. The doctor insisted, she said, and as a detainee brought to the hospital in handcuffs and shackles, she felt pressured to consent. It was only after she was deported to Jamaica and had her medical files reviewed by several other doctors that she knew she had been right to raise questions. A radiologist report, based on images of her internal organs from her time at Irwin, described her uterus as being a healthy size, not swollen with enlarged masses and cysts, as the doctor had written in his notes. The cysts she had were small, and the kind that occur naturally and do not usually require surgical intervention. I didn't have to do any of it, Ms. Doe said. The Irwin County Detention Center in Osceola, Georgia, drew national attention this month after a nurse, Dawn Wooten, filed a whistleblower complaint, claiming that detainees had told her they had their uteruses removed without their full understanding or consent. Since then, both ICE and the hospital in Irwin County have released data that show that 2 full hysterectomies have been performed on women detained at Irwin in the past 3 years. But first-hand accounts are now emerging from detainees, including Ms. Doe, who underwent other invasive gynecological procedures that they did not fully understand, and in some cases may not have been medically necessary. In many cases, Dr. Amin's patients said they were confused about why they ended up being sent to his office in the first place, some after raising medical issues that had nothing to do with gynecology.
Another victim is Yuridia from Mexico. Yuridia is a 36-year-old immigrant from Mexico, sought out a nurse at the center soon after she arrived because she was having pain in her rib after a fight with her abusive ex-partner, just before she got picked up by ICE. She asked to be identified by her first name because she was feared for her safety. She was sent for a medical exam at Dr. Amin's office, where she began to prepare for an ultrasound machine. She says, "I was assuming that they were going to check my rib. The next thing I know, he was doing a vaginal exam." Dr. Amin recorded in his notes that Yuridia had cysts in her ovaries and scheduled surgery to remove them. He also wrote that she had complained of heavy menstruation and pelvic pain. She said that she had never experienced or reported these conditions and that she had not asked to see a gynecologist. Weeks later, she underwent surgery. Pathology reports show that she did not have any dangerous cysts, but small ones of the kind that naturally occur to most women that do not need surgical intervention. Yuridia said she had expected only a minor procedure that would be performed vaginally, but she was surprised when she woke up to find 3 incisions in her abdomen and a piece of skin missing from her genital area. I woke up and I was alone and I was in pain, and everyone spoke English, so I could not ask any questions, Yuridia said. 3 days later, still sore and recovering, she was deported. Dr. Amin had many cases like this. For the women we were talking about earlier, Wendy Doe, she had another surgery that she did not consent to, according to this article. After the procedure, Dr. Admin wrote in his notes that Mrs. Doe requested a second surgery, a full abdomen hysterectomy, and for removal of all of her ovaries. But Mrs. Doe insists that she did no request. A note in her medical records from the detention center appears to corroborate her denial. Detainee is requesting a second opinion to have a hysterectomy, it reads. OBGYN scheduled hysterectomy and patient refused. And the list goes on and on.
Immigrants, as well as many minorities in the U.S., go through such cases constantly and almost daily. Sharing such stories and information is so greatly important, for the fight for justice is long from over, and we must educate other people and ourselves about such injustices in order to take our first steps towards real change.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was brought to you by Coffee Convos with Michelle and Sofia.